Phil Spencer's latest media tour makes it clear. Phil Spencer has gone on a little bit of a media tour following what I would consider to be a successful Xbox Direct, where they showed off a smattering of games that are going to be landing on Game Pass this year. All the titles seem relatively well received. While I'm personally looking forward to Doom, I'm sure other people listening to this are probably more interested in Avowed that will be landing in February that actually was not even shown off. So, Game Pass is lined up, it is primed, it is ready, which meant Phil Spencer should do a media tour. But now he's done a couple of these, some big, some small. And this time around, it was really directed upon, if you will, sort of the evolution of Xbox, because what was once known as a plastic cartridge that you slap down into your favorite legacy console, that is no longer the way that it really functions anymore. And so that is sort of what Phil has been broadcasting for, quite candidly, at least a year, if not longer. And so let's dive into the details, because when things start to get nuanced, and I think there's some correct things that Phil said, and then some assumptions that he said that I don't think are actually really something you should base things off of. So let's just dive in here. So all the sources will be linked down in the descriptions below. Here we go. Phil Spencer has come out and says, I believe it's an identity that this industry needs in response to talking about the evolution of Xbox brand. Now, what does that evolution mean? We all know what that means. That means putting games on every platform at pretty much any time. I think at this point we can consider that Halo going to PlayStation or even Nintendo is probably going to happen. Like, the odds of that happening are much higher than them not happening going forward. Microsoft and Xbox, for that matter, are trying to figure out how to maximize revenue. That is what they do. And with this new sort of era that we are in, that is how it functions. And so, like, real specifically, when questioned about Starfield. Now, Starfield was a very big exclusive for Xbox, and Destin, on his new Patreon channel, said, look, can you solidify that Starfield is staying put for the time being? And Phil Spencer was real candid, and he was saying no, which basically means, like, it doesn't get any more clear than that. There's been comment by Phil Spencer, like, there's no red line, red circle about games that can't, like, that is done. That is over. Xbox games, just consider the fact that they will be going to every platform going forward. That is just going to be the norm. That is how Xbox itself is going to survive. And this is where I think things start to get really interesting, because Phil Spencer points out that the biggest games we all know, Call of Duty, Fortnite, Madden, FIFA, they're always on all platforms, and you can't have an industry title that's locked to your own platform if you want it to be a big title. Like, these things are counterintuitive. You can either focus on selling hardware or focus on selling games, because these things can be at odds. Yes, there was a time and place where that was not maybe true, maybe like the late 90s, something like that, maybe even earlier. But for Xbox, they are shifting to selling titles first, right? Selling content first, hardware second. I've said that a couple times now, but Phil Spencer is just really reiterating and doubling down on the fact that they are selling these things first, selling the games first. And so you can't do that if you're focused on selling hardware. They are at odds, which this isn't necessarily new information, but it really, like, when the head of Xbox is saying, look, we're going to be selling games first, like, you got to be listening. You can't just, like, plug your ears and say, well, they're still a hardware company. No, they're really not. And that is what they keep saying. That doesn't mean necessarily, and this is where he kind of, I don't want to say backs up a little bit, but he definitely talks about, like, hey, we're not giving up on hardware, because one of the concerns is that Xbox moves more directly into this publishing model. What happens to hardware? Now, one of the things that I definitely think you have to latch onto when it comes to content and games, and Xbox for that matter, of all the companies that develop games on planet Earth, no company does it better than Xbox, allowing you to access previously purchased titles, meaning back catalog, right? That has been a hallmark of what Xbox has done better than any other company. And I think this is something you have to keep in mind going forward, because especially with this generation, and it started last generation, but digital purchases are now the norm, right? We no longer buy the physical discs. I know some people probably still do, but the vast majority buy these digital libraries. And making sure your digital library can go with you wherever you are is actually a really big deal to Xbox. And that it's not just lipstick, on a scenario sort of thing, or lipstick on a pig, as some people would say. It's more of the fact that this is what Xbox is known for. And as the industry evolves and you start moving from device to device to device, which is what Xbox is trying to pioneer, they want your library to go with you. And that is a really big deal. And that might be a reason why people continue to buy Xbox hardware, because again, if you bought something on a PlayStation 4, a digital purchase, you don't have the guarantee like you do on the Xbox side that it's going to come forward with you. Xbox, or I should say PlayStation at one point, continued to say they believe in generations, although that has really melted away this time. And so we don't know what their go forward plans are, but if you're looking at companies and saying like who's done it well in the past, Xbox gets all the credit for that, because that is something that they want to be known for. And I think it's really, really important. And Phil Spencer goes on to really drill into this. He goes, I want people to pick up hardware based on the capabilities of the hardware, and that's how it fits into their choices, and blah, blah, blah. And he goes on, and that sort of bleeds into the next narrative where he goes on to say, hey, I want people to pick hardware and pick Xbox because of its capabilities. That is a really dangerous thought. I think he leaning into the, hey, you should pick Xbox hardware because look, we've made it known that your games travel with you from each generation, is a bigger sell than going off of pure hardware. And you might be saying, but Brad, why would you? That is absolutely true. Look, you can go look at history all the time and figure out that better hardware does not win. Like one of the most popular ones, Betamax, was very clearly superior, but look, it lost out. Even this console generation, the Xbox Series X is more powerful on paper than the PlayStation, but we all know how that has played out. And so Phil Spencer leans into this concept of like, hey, we want people to pick hardware based on the capabilities of that hardware and how that fits into their choices. And there's other quotes from him talking about being better hardware sort of thing. But that's not really, I don't think that's a good narrative personally, because it's proven time and time again that better hardware doesn't win. Easier use makes things work, right? Remember, we used to, well, I shouldn't say all of us, depending on how old you are, used to pirate music. Like Napster was huge back in the day. It wasn't until iTunes showed up with a very easy purchasing model that made people move over to iTunes. That is sort of where Xbox is at. It's not perfectly aligned to that analogy because we're in a different era, but being able to bring your content with you is a very big thing, and something I think Xbox has figured out. And once you say it, it's real obvious, right? People don't switch consoles because they can't take their library with them. Like if you are a hardcore PlayStation 4 customer and you bought a ton of digital titles, and then you have a PlayStation 5 and you bought a ton of digital titles, what is the likelihood that you're going to switch over to Xbox where you know for a fact there is 0% chance that your digital library is going to travel with you? That is a very severe negative. And Microsoft, I think they've fully understood this, and this maybe not like this week sort of thing, but in the recent past realized like, hey, look, when we launch a console, getting somebody over from the PlayStation side is incredibly difficult because of that library problem. And so the only people we're selling to are people who already have invested in Xbox content libraries, and then they're moving forward. Yes, there are absolutely going to be some net new people, right? People are still moving into the gaming ecosystem, but they're also at that point, then it's a fresh start. And like if you're looking at a John Doe or Jane Doe and they have zero digital gaming library, where would you go tell them to go start playing today? Most of us would probably say, go to the PC. And so I think Xbox is like, look, if we start locking exclusives behind our hardware, we are going to severely limit who is going to be able to buy our games. And it's hard to justify those $100 million plus titles that are floating around. Now, saying all that, Xbox, again, in the conversations made it clear they are not giving up on hardware. It's at the core, it's at the ethos of what it is. Phil Spencer even says, look, boxes in the name. Like, you got to have something physical. And so they will continue to build these things. That is a given. However, I think this is where we're going to start to see the shift. And we heard Jason at the next handheld event back at CES. Phil Spencer here's talking about it today. Look, we're going to put games everywhere. Switch 2, he congratulated them on launching it. And it's like, look, we know titles are going to Switch 2, and even they're mandated to because of Call of Duty and that acquisition. But there's more to it than that. This starts to bleed into the conversation we've already had that if Xbox is going to be putting games everywhere, the games that they make for Xbox have to be easily portable to the other platforms, which again makes Xbox more PC-like experience, and almost guaranteed will be exactly PC-like going forward. That way it's easier to start bringing their titles to more platform at a lower cost, because again, they're trying to sell titles, not necessarily hardware. They're not giving up on hardware. Phil Spencer's made that very clear, but they're not selling hardware first, and which if you know anything about Microsoft, of course they're not going to try to sell hardware first. They don't make as much money on hardware as they do. And so the big question that you hear all this, and it's sort of a culmination of things that have been floating around. My big question though is like, how does this impact Game Pass? Because Game Pass today, I cannot imagine that there's going to be Game Pass on PlayStation. I cannot imagine, at least as of right now, there would be Game Pass on Nintendo Switch. I'm sure Xbox would love to put that on there. I don't think the other platforms are going to allow that. So how does this impact the Game Pass strategy? It's an interesting conversation, because if you go back to that John Doe or Jane Doe who's a brand new gamer, well, yes, PC makes sense from getting all the titles, but Game Pass continues to be the best value. It's a very solid deal for what you get versus what you pay. The question becomes, and this is the question I sort of impose upon dear listener, does by going to this strategy, is that going to negatively impact Game Pass growth? If you say yes, does that mean that Microsoft looked at their strategy and looked what was happening with Game Pass and said, look, we got to pivot, and so we're doing this? Or do you think it will help enhance sell more consoles because people are going to see Game Pass again continue to be invested in by the additional revenue by selling titles on more platforms and make it a better value? More people will then likely buy the console. I don't know, right? You have this. Game Pass could, in theory, become less valuable because people just don't want to buy an Xbox console because you can get other games elsewhere. Or you could pivot it and say, look, it becomes a better value because all the big titles land in there. It's still a one-time fee, and so that's why you should buy the hardware. The thing that Microsoft has made very, very clear is that the reason you should potentially buy an Xbox console is Game Pass. I believe that. I also think the digital library is part of it. I would not be pushing hardware specs. That is not a marketing message that resonates well with the consumer. It resonates well in the fanboy wars, which, as we all know, amount to zilch and nothing. So Xbox is certainly evolving. We are in the middle of this shift. We might even say we're potentially in like the second half of the shift. Now that the shift, the marketing messages have been out there. They keep landing similar style messaging, and Phil Spencer is here talking about future of how they're going to evolve. So we're through, like the halfway point of the marketing side of this, and now we're going to start to see the materialization of all that from not only publishing but also the hardware perspective. And so from a business shift, like this is the stuff I love. This is what keeps me up, not keeps me up at night, like gets me out of bed, because it's like, okay, if you don't find this fascinating, here's why. You have a $1 trillion company, with $100 billion, I don't know what Xbox would be valued at by itself, but tens of $1 billion brand, if not more, $100 billion brand, whatever you want to call it. They find themselves with their back against the wall a little bit ago, and they have to shift the business. They have to figure out how to survive for the next 30 years. And so if you don't find that fascinating, well, I don't know what to tell you, but I certainly do, as they try to, they look at the gaming field ahead of them, and they say, how are we going to navigate the landmines that we know that are there, the landmines that we don't know that are there, and then justify the investments that we have made? It is super fascinating to watch Xbox pivot, and we're here for the ride. And so, as always, my friends, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.